again. This video is slightly unusual really for two reasons. One, I'm doing it from the comfort of my own place, my own computer desk. The main reason for doing that is that I've recently come out of hospital and I'm recuperating. Everything is going fine, but I just don't want to push myself too hard and go out and about with the camera equipment. It's unusual for the second reason that I want to comment on some sort of hot off the press news, if you like, about this beast, the Canon firmware update, which applies to models in their mirrorless range, and namely this particular one's the R3, but I believe the firmware will affect everything apart from the baseline EOS R. Namely, that it will now do, and if you haven't seen this already, then I suggest you listen very carefully and make sure you're sitting down. It will shoot 195 frames per second in RAW. That's 195 frames every second in RAW. Now there are caveats to that, which I'll come on to. But the news about this, and the YouTuber that I saw is a certain gentleman with very frizzy hair. He was very enthusiastic about it, and although I can see certain advantages, in my humble opinion, they are going to be rather limited. And I wanted to give you my reasons for saying that. If you then move on to the 1960s and 1970s, and that era coincides with my own blossoming interest in serious photography, then you have the likes of Canon and Nikon bringing out dedicated SLR cameras which are motor driven. In the case of this particular one, their first model was the Nikon F motor drive, and it could shoot at 7 frames per second. Doesn't sound too bad. The downside was that you had to operate it with the mirror locked up, so you lost through the lens viewing, hence the turreted viewfinder on the top, because that was the only way that you could actually see what you were going to photograph. Later on, in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, they brought out the wonderful, in my opinion, still one of the best cameras ever made, that being the F2. And the MD2 motor drive unit for that would allow people to shoot up to 5 frames per second, but with the mirror down, so you didn't lose through the lens viewing. So quite an advantage, really. Of course, back in those days, this is pre-autofocus, and sports photographers in particular, and I'm emphasising the sports photography aspect of it because that's what Jared, Mr. Fro, is a specialist in. Sports photographers needed something to make focusing much easier and much quicker, and people who had the budget were able to invest in things like this wonderful device, which is a 400mm no flexar telephoto lens attached to the NovoFlex trigger grip. Now the trigger grip does exactly what it says on the tin. You squeeze the trigger and it changes the focus for you. Spring loaded, so when you release the trigger, focus goes back out again. And that was really, really useful for very many top-line sports photographers. And now we move on to this absolute beast of a camera, the Canon R3, the 195 frames per second. Now the caveats that I mentioned, twofold really. First and foremost, the maximum number of shots it will take in this high-speed mode is 50. And 50 shots takes all of 0.2 of a second for the camera to actually take. It's all done and dusted in 0.2 of a second, and you've got 50 images just like that. Raw images, don't forget. Now, I can understand people's enthusiasm for it. If you are a sports photographer, you're looking for that kind of edge, I guess, over the competition. But I really do wonder whether we're going down the right route with all this kind of high-speed automation approach, because the other caveat with the Canon, well, there are 3 caveats in total. I sound a bit Monty Python there. Caveat number 1 is that it will only take 50 images, only 50 images in a burst. Second caveat is that the autofocus then is deactivated. Third caveat is that the auto exposure is also deactivated. Now, exposure is not so much of an issue, but focus I'm sure can be. In the example that Jared describes, the image that he shows is of the baseball player, the batter, taken from sideways on. So there's no movement coming towards or away from the camera. It's a fantastic shot, don't get me wrong, but it's taken in profile, if you like. So the auto-focusing being switched off hasn't affected the image whatsoever. If you were taking images where the action is approaching the camera or going away from the camera, then having the autofocus switched off, even for 0.2 of a second, could be pretty important. This photo is of a high-flying Audi Quattro from the 80s, coming towards the camera at well over 100 miles an hour. You can see it's well into the air. Now at 100 miles an hour, it is moving at least 50 feet towards you, if not more, in that 0.2 of a second. So I'm not saying you wouldn't get one sharp image out of the 50, but I'm not 100% sure that you would get the benefit of all 50 images when the car is travelling so quickly towards you. This second shot is of a gymnast on the uneven bars, I think they're called these days. In my day they were called asymmetric bars. Anyway, she is leaping from one bar to the higher one, which is the one in the shot. Again, she's coming towards the camera. And again, I feel that this sort of 50 frame burst in 0.2 of a second, it's not going to be all that beneficial. In my book, I don't care what your genre of photography is, and I'm going to go on to explain about this in this second section, if you like. We all have different subject matter that we enjoy. And I think it's time that we all took stock of our own little time capsule, the time schedule that we all work to, irrespective of what type of subject matter we're interested in. If we look, for example, at one of my all-time favourite sports photographers, this gentleman by the name of Eamon McCabe, one of my claims to fame is that I sold Eamon a Bronica S2A when he came to visit his mother, who at that time anyway was living on the Wirral. But Eamon took some wonderful sports images. Here's one of a rugby football match. He rose to prominence mainly after covering the Heysel stadium disaster, which is a completely different aspect of sports photography. He was there at the time, and obviously he was concentrating, once he realised the severity of the accident, he was concentrating on the crowd's reaction, and this image it's haunting. It really is. So Eamon, great sports photographer, he would have had access to cameras like the Nikon F2, F3. I'm not sure whether he preferred Canon. I don't know. They would all certainly have been fitted with motor drives, maybe doing up to 9 frames a second. But he still had to be in the right place at the right time. Now, if we change tack and think about another aspect of photography, photojournalism, and in this case, war photography, this gentleman, Robert Capa, is world famous for his images. Probably two of the most famous images are this one, taken during the Spanish Civil War, I think, Death of a Soldier. There's some argument as to whether it was staged or not. My point is, does it really matter? It still stands as a fantastic image. And probably more importantly, his photographs taken on D-Day. This one, which is one of only a very few that survived being basically fried in the darkroom. It's an iconic image. And if you're interested, Robert Capa on D-Day was using one of these, which is a Zeiss Icon Contax Model 2. No motor drives, anything like that. Basic mechanical camera. Another very famous war photographer, in fact he's probably famous for his war images more than anything else, is Mr. Don McCullin. Now, Don was probably made famous by being the man whose life was saved when an AK-47 bullet hit his Nikon F, and here it is. That's what it looked like after the impact. The particular portrait of Don is taken a little bit later on when he was using Olympus OM gear. But all of these photographers that I'm going to mention now are far and away more than just one-trick ponies. They may be famous for doing one particular type of photography, but they're so talented. And their timing is what makes them. If you look at this next image, this is by the same photographer. This is another Don McCullin image, and this is taken of an Irish vagrant in London, I think. But what a powerful portrait that is. It's absolutely stunning. And he actually came and did a tour of Liverpool, visiting some of the areas that were being cleared. Some of the slums were being flattened. And this particular image of the young boy, my point here is that it's all about timing. I don't care whether you've got 50 frames in 0.2 of a second. You can be doing this kind of image of a young lad hopping across the puddles, and if you time it right, you get a classic picture like this. Just fantastic. One of the all-time great photographers is this man, Henri Cartier-Bresson. Now, Bresson worked to a different time scale. He was famous for quoting the decisive moment. Many of his photographs portray a perfection in timing of the shot. Look at this one of the gentleman jumping across the puddles, trying to keep himself dry. Is it sharp? No. Is it a fantastic photograph? Damn right it is. In this next one, taken in London, we see a gentleman doing a similar thing, hopping down some steps, again to avoid a puddle of water. Perfection when it comes to timing. And what about this one? The silhouette of the people with the Eiffel Tower in the background. I mean, just words fail me. But timing is of the essence. Would he have used or needed a motor drive? No, absolutely not. Another famous photographer, and one that I admire the work of, is this gentleman, Mr. Bert Stern. Now, Bert Stern was primarily an advertising photographer, did other things. In this image, you can see him on hands and knees in the desert with a camel in the background. and you're thinking, what on earth is he doing? This is what he was doing. One of the best, in my opinion anyway, one of the best advertising photographs I've ever seen for Smirnoff, the vodka people. The Great Pyramid of Giza reflected and of course inverted in the martini glass. Just a fantastic advertising image. Timing again though, he would have had to know the time of day, the day in which to take the photograph, and of course the position of the sun relative to the camera. He needed to shoot into the light in order to get the reflection coming through the drinks glass. Just a fabulous, fabulous advertising photo. And he was very famous for taking photographs of his friend Marilyn Monroe. And in fact, this is one of the photographs taken at her last ever sitting with him in 1962. It was one of the very last photographs ever taken of Marilyn Monroe. Very talented guy. All of these people are. You won't see me putting any of my images up in comparison to these guys, trust me. Another hero of mine is an English gentleman, emphasis on gentleman, and it's Patrick Lichfield, or Lord Lichfield. I had the pleasure of going to see one of his in-person appearances at the Philharmonic Hall in Liverpool here back in the 70s. He was famous for photographing royalty and film stars in the main. Here is a perfect example of absolutely spot-on timing. This is the actress Joanna Lumley. And just look at the pose and the vertical nature of the walking stick. Had he stuck the walking stick in the ground? I don't know. I strongly suspect he didn't. It's just perfect timing. The decisive moment, if ever there was. Another great photographer. This man, Elliot Erwitt. Elliot Erwitt, American. Look at this image of the dog jumping up. Taken from street level, pavement level. Just an amazing image and a fantastic example of perspective and timing. Here's another one. Low perspective shot again, taken from pavement level, and just this is such an amusing image. Imagination is fantastic. You have the forelegs of what I think is something like a Great Dane, then the owners, the human legs alongside that, and then this tiny little dog, this Chihuahua or whatever it might be, to add just the most crazy scale effect. Fantastic. And timing can be done and used in different ways. Here's another very famous photographer, Yusuf Karsh of Ottawa, as he was known. Probably his most famous portrait is this one of Mr. Winston Churchill. Now the story goes that if you look at Churchill's expression, he's not looking happy. And the story goes that Churchill, when he was posing for his photographs, refused to take his cigar out of his mouth, and Karsh walked up to him, plucked the cigar out of his mouth, turned around, walked back and pressed the shutter button. That's the end result. Is it true or not? I don't know. It makes a wonderful story though, doesn't it? So my emphasis and where I'm coming from with this is that, you know, these fantastic, and don't get me wrong, these fantastic technical innovations and improvements they're fantastic to know about. It's great to have. They're definitely a selling point. But how many of us actually are going to need that staggering 50 frames in 0.2 of a second? Try it. It blows your mind. Ba-boom. It's ba-boom. 0.2 of a second, you've got 50 images. Amazing. But if you time it right, whether you're doing landscapes, whether you're doing portraits, whether you're doing street photography, you can get images just as good, well, maybe not just as good, but you can get images that reflect these ones that you've seen today, because these were taken, yes, they were taken by great photographers, absolutely top of the line photographers, but on equipment which an EOS R3 owner would laugh at today. Bear that in mind. Until the next time, I'm going to say enjoy your photography, and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye for now.